Welcome to Off the Page. I'm Stephen Copeland. In the recent United States presidential election, neither of the two major political parties made environment or climate change a focus in their campaigns. The unfortunate truth one could conclude is that environmental concerns do not motivate the masses to vote. It is this kind of apathy and disconnect from nature that Franciscan friar, author, and professor Keith Douglas Warner has spent much of his career addressing. Could it be that beneath our apathy and disconnect is a spiritual problem? How can Franciscan eco-spirituality help all people to recover a relationship with creation that has been lost? It is my pleasure to share with you this interview with Keith Douglas Warner. Brother Keith, OFM, is Associate Professor of Ethics and Spirituality at the Franciscan School of Theology in San Diego. He is a practical social ethicist in the Franciscan tradition and teaches eco-spirituality, social entrepreneurship, and moral theology. In 2007, he helped author the award-winning Care for Creation, a Franciscan Spirituality of the Earth, with Ilia Delio, OSF, and Pamela Wood. He recently worked to write an expanded edition of Care for Creation, which will be released in December 2024. The expanded edition includes extensive front and back matter which delve into Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. I'm honored to share this interview with you as we near the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si and the 800-year anniversary of St. Francis of Assisi's poem, Canticle of the Creatures. You can order the expanded edition of Care for Creation by visiting shop.franciscanmedia.org. I hope you enjoy this interview with Keith Douglas Warner, but first, a message from our sponsor. Earning a Master of Theological Studies with a Franciscan theology lens is now possible anywhere in the world. The master's program at the Franciscan School of Theology offers a blend of academic engagement and spiritual reflection. You can learn at your own pace while connecting with fellow students and instructors in a respectful and down-to-earth environment. Embark on a 24-month mutually transformative journey with the world-renowned faculty and instructors from FST. The Master of Theological Studies, Franciscan Theology, is 100% online. You can complete it in 24 months, and it is fully accredited. I actually just completed this program, and it's amazing. So I highly recommend it. To learn more, you can visit theologicalstudies.sandiego.edu. Again, that's theologicalstudies.sandiego.edu. Keith Douglas Warner, thank you for joining the Off the Page podcast.
Glad to be with you, Stephen.
Can you talk about your own journey into this field of eco-spirituality? That is a field that maybe some people have not heard of before.
Good. Yes, happy to do so. Eco-spirituality really is an experience of God and faith and prayer in relationship to nature and how one lives one's life. And so for me, this really began as a result of some completely unexpected events in my life. When I was 18, I was going to school at University of California, Davis, and I met this very inspirational ecumenical faith community of young adults who were living very strong biblical Christian ideals. You could also call it a Jesus freak hippie commune. And so I dropped out of school. I was so inspired by them. It wasn't because I wasn't doing well academically, but it just seemed like how they were living and what they were doing in their life project was so much more compelling than going to school. And so we moved to rural Oregon. We sponsored migrants and refugees. We had a Christian rock and roll band. We showed the film Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. This was the late 70s, so even though that movie seems a little like a period piece now, it was very inspirational to me at the time, and it's definitely worth watching. But we had a reforestation co-op, and that's how we made our money. And so for me, this was this dramatic immersion into the forests of Oregon, Washington, Northern California, um, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And so wherever they would go through and cut down trees and log them and create these clear cuts, which really are ugly and they're highly problematic from an ecological perspective, we would go in and plant little baby trees. And so these trees would be like 18 inches tall, maybe. And we would plant 500, 1,000, 1,500, even 2,000 a day. And so this was a very heavy work, but it was also done under the open sky. And in Oregon, that meant pouring rain most of the time. So we would work out in the elements, and it was brutally hard work. But I discovered a beauty about creation there that I had as a result of really being surrounded by creation, even creation that had been suffering from human abuse. There was still this majesty about these ancient forests. And the fact that we would participate in some small way in trying to bring back life in these places that had been devastated for economic exploitation reasons. And so this really was an experience of being largely in silence in nature for most of the year for 5 years, and left a profound impact on me. It taught me things about the material nature of life and the interdependence of life and the relationship between prayer and beauty and healing and God's awesome creative power. And so I began to ask questions. Why did no one seem to be paying attention to our environmental problems when it seemed like this was like a natural kind of visceral experience? And I wasn't the only one. Maybe it wasn't something people would talk about in church. It wasn't back in the 80s, but it was certainly something that was consistent with with St. Francis's experience. And I thought, wow, how awesome is this? What? Here's an example. And so this was left a profound kind of imprint on my spiritual awareness, and thinking of this also in terms of an obligation to act out of love and gratitude. And even though I, at the time wasn't really fully clear on the limitations of a lot of environmental discourse led by NGOs and advocacy organizations, I still felt like this is something that's morally and religiously compelling. So when the first that community fell apart, I looked around and I said, well, I think I want to pursue this in a more intentional sort of way. So that's when I discerned the call to become a Franciscan friar. So I did that, actually. I began the process. I wasn't Catholic, so I went through an RCIA process and then joined the Franciscans back here in the West Coast. And so I've been a friar ever since. And my vocation director, who was a very strong influence in my life, he also had a lot of environmental background, horticulturalist, did graduate studies in theology, wrote his master's thesis in theology on liberation theology and the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. So he said, well, it's really great that you're interested in this integration, but I need to tell you before you sign up, like there's not a lot of established pathways in Franciscan religious life for it. There's sort of like a dawning awareness that we need to be doing some of this, but we don't know how. So in Spanish, there's a nice little saying, El camino se hace por caminar. The road is made by walking. And so that's been a part of my life, is trying to show people, including my own Franciscan brothers, that it's possible and that God desires that there be an integration between our spiritual life and our spiritual practices and our relationship with God and our understanding of ourself and responsible ecological awareness and action. So that's been a long-term dimension of my vocational journey as a Franciscan these 30-something odd years. I thought that becoming a Franciscan was enough to show that off, but apparently that wasn't what my provincial at the time thought. He encouraged me to pursue higher studies, so I went to the University of California, Santa Cruz for a doctorate in environmental studies. And so I spent 5 years writing about sustainable agriculture and social networks. It was very good. And I got a credential as a result of that. And then that really allowed me to teach, but also, frankly, even though it sometimes feels a little kind of like a funny juggle. The reality is I have more, people pay more attention to me as a Franciscan with a doctorate than just a kind of a crazy Franciscan who has crazy ideas. And that seems to be the way the world works, for better or worse. It's given me actually access to a lot more resources to be able to help students and organizations to engage in this kind of work. So I've taught a lot of environmental ethics, Franciscan spirituality. I've worked a lot on sustainable development projects using social enterprise techniques and strategies. And so I've also written an awful lot about this in the English-speaking Franciscan world. And so now I teach about it, and I'm active in the Diocese of San Diego here, which is led by Cardinal McElroy, who's a very firm supporter of Laudato Si and its message. So that's a little bit about my own work, both kind of the practitioner side of things, working with people in communities, working at teaching, helping students to do this, trying to influence the friars and other Franciscan institutions to incorporate more of this kind of perspective and thinking, and then also writing about this for audiences that are both specialized and general.
Yeah, I have so many questions. Could we go back to when you were 18 and you find this hippie Jesus movement group? I think that's the way you described it. What was your family, what were your friends' reactions when you went away with this group into the forests?
Well, Stephen, this was a long time ago now. And even when I tell my students about this, they get intrigued and want to know if that's something that's available to them. And I was like, no, the 70s are over. So
we're bringing it back. We're bringing it back.
So it seems very hard to capture it here in 2024 on the kind of the aftermath of the recent election, the direction of American society. It just seems very incompatible with our ideals back then here, especially on the left coast, where we were really like looking at ecological consciousness. It was just part of how large sectors of society were beginning to think and still do. But in terms of putting myself back in this moment, well, like I said, this is a long time ago, and it wasn't very far removed from the Jonestown mass suicide event by a cult in South America. So a lot of people, including my parents, were deathly afraid that I was joining a similar group. But it was really a question of ideals and how to fulfill one's ideals, and how we wanted to make the world a better place and be more faithful people, and taking a very strong stance towards simple living, towards outreach and proclaiming good news to others. And this was really kind of in the same kind of era. We were very strongly influenced by Jim Wallace and Sojourners. We were strongly influenced by the L'Arche community movement, by Joan Chittister and her work, by Richard Rohr. So these were all kind of, people that we thought about as sort of like good teachers, that we were trying to figure out how to translate that into how we would actually live together. And at the height, there were about 50 of us, men, women, singles, families. That was very interesting, but it was a very long time ago now.
Yeah, you said you didn't grow up Catholic, correct?
Right.
So how did you learn about St. Francis and this Franciscan way of life?
Oh, well, I first heard about it through Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, because this group was go around showing it as a movie, as a kind of a form of outreach and discipleship, evangelization. So I was very moved by that. Of course, I had to sort of like kind of be deprogrammed by some of the not quite so historically accurate pieces in that movie, but it still captures the spirit, especially in light of the post-Vietnam era. And so then I read Murray Bodo's The Journey and the Dream. I practically memorized it. And then I was very surprised in my later years with that group when I discovered that Franciscans still existed. It's like, really? Oh, how come I didn't know about this? And then when my old group fell apart, then that was the next logical move. And so, I would say that, there are lots of different avenues into the Franciscans, and some people are very Catholic and they want to become priests and they like St. Francis and they kind of come in one door. But me, I was sort of like really committed to a Franciscan way of living in the contemporary world. And so that has sort of like pointed me towards this business of teaching and learning and formation and education and outreach, both in the Franciscan spirit, spiritual tradition of today, and also for fostering kind of a more just, humane, and sustainable world.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned that you essentially spent 5 years in silence in the forests of Oregon and Northern California, you said?
Washington, Colorado,
Okay.
Wyoming,
Yeah.
Anna. Yeah.
Go a little bit deeper into that for me, if you would, about the impact that those 5 years had on your heart and mind. That's such a unique experience. You're immersed in creation at a very young formative time in your journey.
Right. Well, it depends how you want to approach these kinds of experiences, right? Because there were lots of very rough men groups that were not affiliated with any spiritual tradition. Most tree planters that I knew that were not in our group were like ex-cons and drunks who would just get it together enough to stagger out and work out and make a few bucks. Now, of course, most of this work is done by Mexicans because Caucasian people don't want to work that hard. So, but for me, it was an extended periods of silence, not kind of cursing, but like kind of reflecting. And so I later developed the vocabulary and the understanding and the insight as a Franciscan to really claim that experience as contemplative with boots on, contemplative in the pouring rain, not contemplative as in sitting in stillness. That's one very fine way to practice contemplative prayer. But this was contemplation in terms of inserting my hand in Mother Earth hundreds of times a day, planting a tree, expressing a hope for something to come back, and then kind of staggering on to the next place over rocks and branches and through the rain and mud. So, it was very painful and difficult at hard at times, but it was also beautiful and inspiring. And, most people don't do it with a sense of interiority. Again, another term that I really found helpful from reading Thomas Merton and kind of brought that kind of sense of interiority. It's like, oh yeah, that's kind of like how I'm experiencing this. That's maybe different from like average tree planting people who are not interested in God or faith.
Yeah. Can you go deeper into that word interiority and what that means to you, or perhaps what it meant to Merton?
Well, it's just a sense of having an inner life with God and attending to that and caring for that and your in yourself. Knowing yourself, knowing that God dwells there, shapes us, and God calls us each day to take actions and to live within the vision of God's will for this world and to bring about the reign of God on earth. And so this is actually something I learned a lot through conversations with Ilia Delio as well, is because she when we were trying to figure out how to exactly go about writing this book, I can tell that story in a moment. The first version is she talks a lot about the relationship between spirituality and awareness. So she says like she feels that those words are kind of interchangeable in the religious setting, that spirituality means awareness. And so without awareness, there isn't spirituality. And so, in my own master's study, we talked about the difference between theology, which is sort of like teaching, and then there's the experience, which is really like what spirituality focuses on, is like the inner life of people and their experience of God.
Yeah. You mentioned Care for Creation, the first edition came out in 2007. What was that process like? I mean, you had an all-star lineup of authors, yourself, Ilia Delio, Pam Wood. What was the authorship of that book like? And what did you learn perhaps about yourself or eco-spirituality in the process of working with these other two authors?
Well, I had met Ilia in 2004, and then in 2005 we were at a conference, a workshop, giving a presentation on justice, peace, and care for creation. to a group of Franciscan friars. And so that's when she proposed that we write a book together. And I said, oh, that sounds great. And so she said that people like short books. True. She likes writing popular books as well as specialized journal articles. So do I. But she said it's also good to have some practical application. And I said, oh, okay. Yeah, I know a woman who might do good at that. And so I knew Pam Wood, who is both an art therapist and a kind of a practitioner of eco-spirituality, a kind of a popular teacher working with lots of groups, especially young adults and folks who are interested in ecological spirituality. So, first of all, Ilia is a brilliant woman who can write a chapter in a day. And I'm in awe of her because she would say what she's going to do. And then the next day the chapter would appear. It's like, oh my God, I cannot write that fast. And so, I think she can just like write as fast as I can think on a good day. The idea was like, I wrote the chapters on, the kind of like the environmental studies, environmental reality, trying to make an interpretation of that to kind of cue up Ilia writing the chapters on the Franciscan intellectual tradition. And so that she did the theologizing based on this. And then Pam would write the chapters 3, 6, 9, kind of in dialogue with me about how to create activities that would drive this in deeper into a person's awareness and help them build communities of support. Because we need communities to foster hope and a sense of being able to do this together. So it took a little while to figure out how to do that work kind of together, because you just have to figure out how to have a conversation that makes sense. But you can kind of see, actually, there's a kind of a Franciscan logic to the organization of the book, which distinguishes it from other books, frankly, in this field, because it starts inductively, experientially. It starts with evidence, like what is happening. And then what does it mean? Those were the chapters that Ilia wrote. And then there's like, what shall we do? Or you could say it's like see, judge, act. But even so, most books aren't written that way. We've still got this bias towards starting, with abstract principles and working it out. And that's not really the Franciscan approach. That's like a top-down, deductive approach. That's one way to do theology, but it's only one way. Lots of people who are resisting Franciscan approaches, or the Pope Francis as well, we prefer this. Let's start with what is. And you could say we have a bias towards a contemplative point of departure. But there are lots of voices in the church that think that's a terrible idea. And so, but that's part of the appeal of the book. And so I was very pleased at how many people read it. I was very pleased with how it kind of works in harmony. These different components work in harmony. I think that Pam and Ilia have done at least a couple of workshops or conferences. Ilia is like, she draws a big crowd. I've done a few things with Pam, but not lately. And so, but I've used the book a lot in classes. Do people really like it? Because you kind of learn about eco-spirituality and Franciscan spirituality at the same time. That's one of the reasons why it's been so valuable. And so, I think we're all kind of proud of being able to see the book come along. And as I write in the expanded edition, it's like, well, I figured when Laudato Si came out, that was it. Because that was people going to read that instead of this book. But it turns out that people actually want a book that sort of unpacks some of the ideas of Laudato Si and makes it more accessible. And here again, where I think what Pam did is so focused on this kind of how to take these ideas and do something with your body. Again, an incarnational approach, but it's not just like reading about an incarnational approach. It's about like, do these things. So then you have a sense of like this completion of it, the pieces fitting together.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Laudato Si and how you wove that into the expanded edition. You wrote in the preface about how you spent a lot of time contemplating Laudato Si in 2017 while in Greccio. What impact did that encyclical have on your life and your work, and what opened up for you during that time in Greccio?
Well, so there had been rumors about Laudato Si as an environmental encyclical when it first, so from the beginning of Pope Francis's pontificate. And so at one point I got a Skype call, yes, back when we used to use Skype, from a Franciscan friend of mine who was in Rome, and he had heard a story of there being a general audience between the leadership of the Franciscan order with the Pope and presumably Cardinal Turkson and those who were involved in writing Laudato Si. And the Pope asked if there were any Franciscans who had written about this, and our uh, Minister General said, "Oh yes, Keith Warner, you should get some of his things." So I'd heard, he told me, this friend of mine told me that this had happened at a papal audience. Like, really, that sounds so like
no big deal.
Like, I read it from cover to cover right there. It's like, oh, I didn't make the footnotes. Now, in reality, this book here is quoted. This is a book about Francis of Assisi early documents. So this book is quoted properly, and clearly the people who wrote the encyclical knew, or I'm sure drafted it before Pope Francis wrote it. They knew this well. A fun fact: Peter Cardinal Turkson, who was the head of the dicastery for integral human development, did an extra theology graduate degree at a conventual seminary in upstate New York. So he got exposed to the Franciscan tradition, even though he was a diocesan priest originally from Ghana. Yeah, sure. I was on my 25th anniversary in Greccio in Franciscan Italy in 2017. But perhaps more importantly, I'd read Laudato Si. I mean, I just carried it in my pack everywhere I went, and I read it dozens of times. And so I would teach from it in every class. So I was there on kind of on the side of the cliff, looking out of the Rieti Valley, and I would say that it's a beautiful location. This is, of course, where Francis had his experiences of praying the creche and kind of really founding the process of Franciscan devotion to the Nativity, or that's where the record shows that this took place. Francis kind of performed the celebration at the Nativity, and again brought his heart and his whole being into the kind of worship and praise and gratitude for this event. So they built this friary around it, and it's a kind of a quiet, contemplative place, like a little retreat house. It receives lots of pilgrims, and they really like their nativity scene that's there. But there's this little catwalk that wrapped around the back of the friary that you could only get to through the cloister. And so I was walking back there and reading passages from Laudato Si and praying and looking out at the valley of considerable beauty. And I thought, it came to me like, the balance of my religious life is to translate Laudato Si from text into life. And so that's what I do. That is kind of like a call within a call, or a clarification. And I would just say that it's not, anybody who knew me didn't exactly fall out of their chair when they heard this, because it was within the expected parameters of someone who has this unusual religious vocation, as such as it is. But it's also it kind of gives me more focus. So if people ask me to do anything at all to do with Laudato Si, I say yes, and then figure it out. And then if people ask me to do general other things, and I'm like, well, I don't know, maybe if I can find a way to work it in, I'm already kind of busy. But I would say also now, more recently, that was almost 10 years ago. That was 7 years ago. But I would just say more recently, it's like, well, Pope Francis is coming up with so many different ideas now. It's sort of like synodality, fratelli tutti. I mean, most Franciscan friars are really all in on the agenda of Pope Francis and his efforts at renewal and really bringing, fostering conversion in the world. And so it doesn't exactly, this experience of mine at Greccio doesn't exactly stand apart from other aspects of my sense of calling and today, but it did sort of like was sort of like one of those experiences where you're like, ping, like,
Yeah.
or kind of like, oh, a lot of things kind of aligned in, and you almost kind of hear it. You don't, I didn't hear a voice, but it was sort of like an awareness,
Back to awareness. Yeah.
back to awareness.
Yeah. I'd like to get into some of the practical implications of Laudato Si in this expanded edition of Care for Creation. But first, I just wanted to ask you, what's it like for you today to reflect on your journey? I mean, you took us through being this 18-year-old kid who goes off with this group and, is immersed in creation through these forests in the northwestern United States. And then here you are in Greccio in 2017, celebrating your 25-year anniversary in religious life as a Franciscan friar. I mean, what an incredible journey you've had with creation as your guide.
Uh, yeah. I mean, I it's I don't know I don't know how to comment on that question. I would just say that it just seems normal for me. I would say it doesn't seem to be normal for too many other people, and that gives me kind of like a degree of sadness that it seems sort of that I seem so exotic to many people.
Why does it give
And
you sadness?
well, just because I think that the message, especially of Laudato Si, is like this is for everybody. And Laudato Si is not some little niche agenda. It's like a whole program for renewing ecologically conscious Catholicism in the global church today. And if I look at the U.S. church and the predominant direction that its leaders are taking, it's like it's turning its back on Laudato Si. It's like I've done a lot of travel as a result of my research and work with students, various countries, lots of poor countries, and everybody knows the climate is being seriously disrupted, and it's having serious long-term impacts on people, especially poor people, especially farmers. And there isn't any discussion over whether or not climate is happening or whether it's some kind of hoax. Like, there's only one country where this is really happening. And so this is where, I find the kind of like the lack of a willingness to speak the truth within our church to be sad, tragic, lost opportunity. And, there's just so many other concerns seem to be filling that up. And I'm also just conscious of last year, Pope Francis wrote Laudate Deum, which really didn't add too much to the teachings of Laudato Si. But again, read the footnotes. Here's the scholar in me. Like, he cited the U.S. bishops very early on, saying what was called for. And then at the end, he said, we can do this as long as we repent from like U.S. style lifestyles and degrees of consumption. Those were like, footnotes are political. And so those were messages that were not like direct. But if you want to understand what the Pope is thinking about, he's like saying, America, you need to lead here. And so right now it seems like we're gearing up to lead in reverse. So, this is like we are headed on the wrong path in this country. According to the moral teachings of Pope Francis. And what's called for is repentance and conversion. I happily and joyfully join with anyone in the church who recognizes the need for that conversion. But this is not a concern of many, many people in America. So then we have to really ask, why is that? This is like, what's the signs of the times? Because we've done lots of really good things in this country, environmentally, many, many good things at different times. And then we kind of backslide. And we appear to be like, not a backslide, but a back run. And so what is it? What is the spiritual cause of this? I think we have to be very honest about this and confront kind of the greed the selfishness and the individualism and the consumerism. These are major factors that are not just bad for our souls, they are affecting our poor brothers and sisters in our Mother Earth. And so this is where this message of conversion is really so important. And it's really like, we have to take it seriously. We have to act on it. And that's what's called for. And that's called for by Pope Francis, by Laudato Si, by Franciscans around the world, clear on this. But it's not a message that people want to hear or act on.
Yeah. Why is that, do you think?
Well, greed, selfishness, individualism, these blind us to others.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, Pope Francis introduced this concept of integral ecology, which is like this holistic understanding of human beings in relationship to God, each other, and creation, and kind of growing in our awareness, our spiritual awareness of the need for balanced and healthy give and take relationships. It doesn't mean we can't cut down a tree, but we shouldn't remove entire forests. It doesn't mean that we have to go back to living in caves, but if we adopted a lifestyle that was moderate, sober, as Pope Francis said, simple and sober, we would work our way out of this mess. But we're too addicted to our stuff, to our power, to our ability to decide for ourselves, and we're too indifferent to the suffering that this causes. Not usually directly, so Americans don't go around like attacking others, but by our consumption and our greed and our indifference, this results in grave harms around the world. We historically have emitted the most greenhouse gases. This is unambiguous. Sure, China's emitting more now, but that's a recent development. We bear the historical responsibility to lead this ecological conversion away from emitting greenhouse gases and towards protecting creation. But we are, we're like Jonah. God called him to Nineveh and Babylon, and instead he got on a boat and head for Spain. We're just not. We're heading in the wrong direction. So this is a source of deep sadness and really kind of sadness and kind of mourning that we so indifferent to the call of creation to us to live in harmony with God and each other. The call of God, of course, coming through the book of nature. These are ancient Christian traditions, and not only Franciscan ones. Maybe they're prominent, relatively more prominent in the Franciscan world today. But these are ancient practices, ancient wisdom perspectives of our church, and they are not popular today.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. One of my favorite quotes from Thomas Merton, he's writing, he says something along the lines of, for many, and he's talking about Americans, and he says something along the lines of, for many, a tree has no reality until they cut it down. It's something along those. And I think he's getting at this need in the American mindset, at least the way I interpret it, this need in the American mindset to commodify things, and he plays a lot with this, like, hey, we'll plant a tree in the city, but we have to dedicate it to the mayor. Like that, there always has to be some kind of meaning attached. But in Franciscan spirituality and in contemplative spirituality, a lot of it comes down to relationality. This tree isn't something for me to commodify, something for me to give it meaning because I've cut it down now. This tree speaks to me. It speaks truth to me about who God is and how we are to renew the earth and be converted in the process. What are your thoughts on that?
2025 is both the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, but it's also the 800th anniversary of the Canticle of the Creatures. And so, of course, many of the listeners to this podcast would be familiar with the Canticle and probably singing it in church and familiar with many of its lines. And certainly it is a beautiful and inspirational song. It gives voice to a Franciscan care for creation in a most beautiful way. But this is another text that's really worth kind of studying and reflecting upon. I believe it's Ilia, but I'm not sure. To be honest, I don't remember the source. But I think Ilia refers to it as a Christic hymn, meaning a hymn that references Christ. And then she explains it. I'm not sure it's in this book, but I'm pretty sure she's talked about it in this way. And so I think that is really like it is other people say that it is a metaphysical statement. Okay, there's a $20 word. So it's sort of like it's describing reality that Francis perceived, not using advanced philosophical technical language, but as a song from the heart, emerging from his contemplative love of creation and his experience of God in creation. It's also, for example, the first song in modern Italian. Even so, it's not exactly that. I mean, it's unusual as reverting to the encyclical. The encyclical is from this kind of medieval Umbrian. It's not from Latin. Almost every other encyclical I know has the first words are from the Latin, and this one is from medieval Umbrian. And so that's so interesting that the Pope decided to kind of deviate, as it were, from tradition in order to embrace this and embrace it as a wisdom text. So there, again, I'm thinking about this relationality that's in the Canticle. It's really, I think, helpful for understanding Francis, who used the term brother hundreds of times. And then that sort of gives us gives me the perspective, and I hope you and your listeners as well. It's all about family, and family is the root metaphor here for understanding Francis's relationship to other people, and to earth, and to creation, and to God. So it's all about always being in relationship and thinking about others, not in this sort of like kind of doormat, milk toast, I don't belong here, not in that kind of sense, but as a part of the family around the celebratory table, or on the outing together, or holding hands. Those are the kind of images that I think are suggested by this, both emerging from Francis's own insight, but also from it speaks to us today, and it's available to us today if we choose to lean into this way of living, this way of seeing, right? Contemplative is kind of an open-eyed prayer. This ability to lean into this allows us to live this way as a kind of an expression of our love for Christ in the contemporary setting. So there's a famous scholar named Paul Ricoeur who talks about texts that have a surplus of meaning, and here we might think of them as like fountains overflowing. And Francis didn't just sit down and scribble off the Canticle like some kind of bubblegum pop song. It's not a superficial. It's simple, but he wrote it as an expression of an inner reality that was cultivated by 20 years of contemplation, especially in nature. He wrote it as he was mostly blind in a hut outside of San Damiano in the midst of great suffering. So that puts a different context on this. This is not like the film Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, where Francis is dancing through the poppy fields and everything's great. No, he felt alienated from the brotherhood he'd founded, and he was laying there in agony, mostly blind. So there's great pain that is a part of the Franciscan story, about Francis's story, and about Franciscans today, even as we gaze upon this kind of great tragedy of our indifference to creation, our selfishness and consumerism at the expense of it, our hard-heartedness towards the very clear suffering of creatures that are being pushed to irreversible extinction, and the suffering of the poor. So this is the conversion that Laudato Si calls us to.
Yeah, I was wondering, You mentioned back when you were 18, coming out of the woods one day, and you were just like, why does no one care? And that has been a theme throughout this conversation, that sadness that has accompanied you as you've embarked on this work. What do you do about that? How do you, I don't want to say combat the sadness, but how how do you work through it and continue to do the incredible work that you're doing, even though it seems like it's been there every step of the way for you in this fight?
Well, I think that um, wrestling with sadness is a part of contemplative living.
Okay.
I think a lot of people will, distract, stuff, shoot up, or drink to avoid feeling it. And, that's not something but those aren't really contemplative. It's, to, embracing a contemplative life of prayer means taking a long, loving look at the really real and not shying away from it and embracing that reality of taking in to a degree the suffering and the injustice that we are witness to. And that's, I think, what we observe in Francis, and I think that's really what the Franciscan vocation includes, that to go deeper, right? To go deeper than, bird baths and, and Operation Rice Bowl, which are, fine, but those are really like not that's swimming in the kiddie pool. I mean, really, we're calling for radical conversion of life. That's what the witness of St. Francis is. And Pope Francis is calling for the ecological conversion of humanity. I mean, echoing what Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI said. And we do not want to hear it.
Yeah, yeah, in that contemplative gaze that you're talking about, that results in taking on the suffering of the world and being open to receiving the pain of our fellow family, our brothers and sisters. I mean, it's hard to sell. It's hard to sell. Yeah, like take on a
Yes.
contemplative gaze and confront sadness. Yes. However, I'm curious what you think about this. In that we awaken to the family that's all around us and the suffering that's around us. And in this sense, there's a freedom there because we're not isolated anymore. Am I on track there? Am I following?
Yes, absolutely. So the sadness, I mean, the sense of loss, the sense of outrage in the injustice, and the kind of and being a witness to self-destruction is a part of the consequence of living a contemplative life. But it's not. It's never isolated from the joy, the sense of communio, the sense of accompaniment, the sense of being touched by God, the sense of God is in this even as humans continue to make a mess of things. Even in the midst of tragedies and injustices, God is still present in some way. And that's part of what needs to be a Franciscan of any kind today, whether vowed or lay, or inspired by. I mean, it means to be walking in a contemplative way through life, love and sorrow going together, and so that this is not. It's never all one or the other. But there's no real life apart from bearing witness to suffering, and one is never left only with suffering if one is truly contemplative.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and I liked how in the expanded edition of Care for Creation, you walked readers through a number of exercises that invite contemplation, that invite this gaze upon the real, to see what is, and therefore take it in and see what the response might be. So can you talk a little bit about this expanded edition, how it came about? And I know that in this work that you've been doing for so many years, that there is that sadness that accompanies this work, like we've talked about. However, there's so much beauty in this expanded edition too, and I sense that there's a lot of hope in there for the future as we move into the 800-year anniversary of the Canticle, the 10-year anniversary of Laudato Si. I mean, however subtle it may be, you are a part of a movement again, like you were when you were 18.
Right. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Darlene Prides, a colleague of mine here at the Franciscan School of Theology and acquisitions editor or something like that at Franciscan Media. So she suggested this, and I said, sure. And part of it is because I've been given so many workshops and retreats and conferences and talks forever about doing something new in light of revising this in light of Laudato Si. So the text of Care for Creation itself is largely unchanged. A few little things were just kind of brought up to current. But really, the new front material is about framing that text in light of what Laudato Si is doing in the church and the world, and how it's a Franciscan wisdom text, Laudato Si is. And then that allows people to enter into the original kind of 12 chapters. And then there's an expanded toolbox at the end, which was written by Pam and myself, Pam Wood, and I wrote this as we describe it as a toolkit for reflective practitioners, meaning this is for people who want to lead others who may not want to read a book, because a lot of people don't want to read books. But that doesn't mean that the impact of the message of Care for Creation is limited to the readers. It's an opportunity to take this into classrooms, into Sunday schools, into community groups, into parishes, into any number of institutional settings and group settings, and to be able to give people an experience that touches on this. So one of them is about taking an inventory of the waste that comes from our home. It doesn't sound attractive, but it's a very compelling thing. Another is looking at another activity is looking at the nature of how we are called to participate in helping others undergo a conversion process, ourselves and others together. And then the last is like a retreat kit for helping with leading others through a process of prayerfully reading passages of Laudato Si and reflecting upon these key words in the Franciscan tradition of praise and love, beauty, for example, as really key words for understanding Franciscan spirituality that are also revealed not just in the texts about St. Francis, but in Laudato Si. And so with all of these things, we're hoping that this expanded edition will help people to be able to take the kind of message of what we crafted some 18 years ago and see it still is valuable, and by expanding it, it will be able to reach more audiences and to continue to carry forward the message of hope and the blessings of undergoing ecological conversion that our Father Francis and the message of the encyclical hold out for us.
Yeah, my final question is, for some people listening, maybe they've never heard the term Franciscan eco-spirituality or integral ecology. I mean, what would, besides buying the book, which I would recommend, but what would be some, next steps or some recommendations you may give to listeners about, hey, I want to join this movement. I want to enter into this conversion experience and finally do something about this.
Well, so there's a lot of resources that are in the book that are identified as kind of next steps. One of them would be to watch the movie that you can find on YouTube called The Letter. So that helps kind of personalize Laudato Si. I would say that finding networks, if you're Catholic, finding networks in the country or in your diocese of other people that are engaged in this. My diocese of San Diego is very active, but we have a very Laudato Si oriented cardinal here. Franciscan Action Network is a very good organization also that can get you started and get you connected with other like-minded people. It's really important to overcome the sense of sadness and loss by joining in community. That's another component of the Franciscan approach here, is that we cannot do this work alone. It is not work to be done alone. And if you try to do it alone, that will be that you will likely fail, because it's meant to be a collective journey. And so with that, I wish everyone who's listening a blessing and a chance to read this book and to act on this, and to be able to put Laudato Si into practice in their own lives as well.
Once again, that was Keith Douglas Warner. Keith's new book, the expanded edition of Care for Creation, A Franciscan Spirituality of the Earth, is available in the Franciscan Media Store at shop.franciscanmedia.org. Huge thanks to our sponsor, the Franciscan School of Theology, and to Brother Keith for joining us on Off the Page. Thank you as always to you for tuning in and supporting this podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with your family or friends. And thank you as well to Cyprian Concilio for providing the music for this episode. I encourage you to check him out on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to your music. This is Stephen Copeland signing off. Peace and all good.
I will lead you into the desert with me and tenderly speak to your